He was a goddamn tyrant. A cold-hearted billionaire who chewed up nannies and spit them out like bad caviar. 7 of them. Fired in less than a year, all because they couldn't fix the one thing his mountains of cash were useless against. His silent, autistic son. They couldn't handle the piercing silence, the vacant stares, the sheer, unrelenting challenge of a child locked in his own world. But then one day, an ordinary Tuesday, the new maid he'd hired just to scrub his toilets and polish his marble floors did something no one else dared. She got down on her knees, reached out her hands, and with a voice as soft as a prayer, she gently urged the broken boy to walk. And against every goddamn odd in the universe, the little boy took his first wobbly, uncertain steps right into her arms. Before we dive headfirst into this insane story, do me a solid and smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a thing. And hey, drop a comment down below and tell us where you're watching from. We love knowing who's on this ride with us. Alexander Sterling arrived home later than usual that evening, the weight of his empire pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The sprawling penthouse, a glass palace overlooking the glittering abyss of New York City, was always silent. It was a sterile, suffocating quiet that had clung to him like a shroud since his wife, Amelia, had been stolen from him. The place felt like a mausoleum, a monument to everything he'd lost, despite the hum of the staff moving like ghosts in the periphery. But tonight, something was different. A flicker of movement in the grand living room snagged his attention, pulling him from his haze of exhaustion and grief. Instead of the usual pristine order, he saw Elena, the new maid, kneeling on the plush Persian rug, her arms outstretched. In front of her, teetering like a newborn fawn on legs that had never truly held him, was Leo, his son. Alexander froze in the entryway, a statue carved from shock and disbelief. He felt a surge of raw, hot anger. Who the hell did she think she was? Elena's face was a mask of serene focus, her expression radiating a calm determination as she coaxed the child forward. Her voice was a gentle murmur, not a command, but a steady, hypnotic invitation. "Come on, Leo. You can do it, sweetheart. Just one more." The boy leaned forward, his tiny arms outstretched, his entire body trembling with an effort that seemed monumental. Alexander's first instinct, honed by months of frustration and failure, was to storm in and put a stop to this charade. To tell her it was pointless. Leo never responded. Leo never tried. The so-called experts with their laundry lists of degrees had all said the same thing. Patience. Low expectations. But something in the atmosphere of the room, a fragile electric tension, held him captive. For the first time, he didn't intervene. He just stood there, a silent observer to this impossible duel between his son and the cleaning lady. Alexander's mind reeled as the scene unfolded. He saw the ghosts of the 7 nannies who had come before Elena, a parade of highly qualified, highly paid professionals who had all walked away in defeat or been dismissed by his own brutal impatience. None of them had lasted because none of them had given him what he truly, desperately craved: a miracle. A replacement for Amelia. Someone who could magically fill the gaping wound she'd left behind. Each woman had tried, armed with textbooks and theories, and each had failed to forge a connection with Leo that Alexander deemed worthy. The guilt was a physical thing, a constant pressure in his chest. Amelia's absence was a debt he could never repay to his son. With every new nanny, his standards grew more impossible, his temper shorter, his disappointment more crushing. But as he watched Elena's unwavering persistence, a profound unease settled in his gut. She wasn't performing for him. She wasn't rushing or panicking under the unspoken pressure of his presence. She was simply there, Her entire world narrowed to the small boy in front of her. She wasn't treating him like a problem to be solved or a project to be completed, but as a child, learning at his own sacred pace. Alexander found himself holding his breath, a prisoner in his own home. Leo's small face contorted with concentration. He took one shaky, miraculous step. Then his fragile balance gave way, and he tumbled forward into Elena's waiting arms. She didn't flinch or show a flicker of disappointment. Instead, she smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that lit up her face. She clapped softly and whispered words of encouragement into his ear, her voice a balm. Alexander, still paralyzed in the doorway, felt a tremor of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a year, a dangerous cocktail of hope and terror. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who was polishing a silver frame in the corner, shot him a look, a silent, urgent warning not to shatter this delicate moment. But Alexander couldn't have moved if the building were on fire. He remembered Amelia, her belly swollen with their son, whispering promises into the night about all the firsts she would witness. His first step, his first word, his first day of school. That dream had been incinerated, leaving Alexander alone in the ashes, desperately trying to piece it back together. And he had failed, spectacularly. Again and again, his power, his name, his billions. They could build skyscrapers, command boardrooms, and bend markets to his will. He could buy anything, anyone. But he couldn't buy his son a single word. He couldn't force those tiny legs to walk. Watching Elena now, he was forced to confront a hideous truth. He had shackled his son's progress to the memory of his wife. Every setback, every missed milestone, felt like another confirmation that Leo was destined for a life of silence, and that he, Alexander Sterling, was a failure as a father. But Elena's quiet celebration of a failed step, her gentle praise for the mere attempt, challenged the very foundation of his cynical certainty. Maybe patience was more valuable than immediate success. Maybe the effort itself was the victory. The thought was a dagger in his chest, and he refused to acknowledge the sting. Elena adjusted Leo on her lap, her movements fluid and unhurried. She set him gently back on the carpet, her face a portrait of endless patience. Leo wobbled as he stood, his little hands opening and closing in the air, grasping for an invisible anchor. Alexander expected him to collapse back to the safety of the floor, as he always did. But he didn't. He shifted his weight forward, his gaze locked on Elena. She held out her hands again, that same unwavering smile on her face, her voice a steady mantra. "You can do it, Leo. I'm right here." The child's steps weren't steps at all, more like a controlled fall. But this time, he managed 2 of them before pitching forward into her embrace. Elena hugged him tightly, celebrating as if he'd just completed a marathon. A strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred in Alexander's chest. It was relief, but it was tangled with a profound, terrifying fear. Relief that his son might not be trapped in this silent stasis forever. Fear that it meant his own approach, his harshness, his impatience, his revolving door of caregivers, had been catastrophically wrong. For the first time, he dared to wonder if the problem had never been Leo or the nannies. Perhaps the problem had been him. His impossible standards, his refusal to accept imperfection, his arrogant belief that grief gave him the right to be a monster. As the evening light faded, painting the city in hues of orange and purple, Alexander finally moved. He walked further into the room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick rug. He didn't speak. He wanted to ask Elena how long she had been doing this, how she had unlocked this tiny piece of his son. But the words were lodged in his throat, choked by pride and shame. Instead, he just watched. He noticed details he'd been blind to before. The way Leo's eyes tracked her every movement. The way the boy seemed to breathe easier in her presence. The way her smile seemed to be the only thing that could penetrate the fog that surrounded him. These were things money couldn't buy. These were things he had completely missed. He had been searching for a perfect caregiver, a flawless substitute for a ghost. He had been so obsessed with finding Amelia's replacement that he'd overlooked the simple, staggering truth. Leo didn't need perfection. He needed presence. He needed patience. He needed someone willing to celebrate the stumbles without fear of failure. Elena, without a single word of instruction, was showing him the chasm between control and care. It was a lesson he had been failing since the day he buried his wife. His chest rose and fell in a heavy rhythm as he finally sank into a leather armchair across the room. He didn't interfere. He just stayed, a silent sentinel, and watched. Leo tried again, falling and rising, always welcomed into Elena's arms like a returning hero. Each attempt was a tiny victory, a spark in the darkness. Alexander felt a tectonic shift inside him. He had spent a year building walls of anger and grief, protecting himself from disappointment, firing anyone who reflected his own failure back at him. Yet Elena's quiet persistence was dismantling those walls brick by brick, and he was powerless to stop her. He didn't know what it meant for the future, but in that moment the suffocating silence that had been his constant companion felt a little less heavy. Watching Leo reach for Elena one more time, Alexander Sterling understood that something was changing. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. And for the first time since he lost his wife, he allowed himself a sliver of hope, a fragile, terrifying thing, as he watched the maid on the floor guide his son forward, one impossible step at a time. Alexander entered the living room, and the sight of Elena on the floor with Leo stopped him cold. For a moment, he simply watched her, her arms open, her voice a soft melody calling to his son. But the fragile hope he'd felt moments before curdled into something ugly and familiar. Rage. His expression hardened into a granite mask. This was wrong. She wasn't hired for this. Her job was to clean, to organize, to remain invisible. Yet here she was, on the floor, coaxing his son to walk as if she were his mother, as if she had the right. A vein throbbed in his temple, his chest tightened. He strode forward, his voice a whip crack in the quiet room, colder and louder than he intended. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Elena froze, her hands still outstretched toward Leo, who immediately plopped onto the carpet at the sound of his father's booming voice. The magic of the moment shattered into 1,000 pieces. Alexander pointed a finger at her, his face a thundercloud. "Your job description does not include playing mother to my son. You are here to clean. That's it. You do not cross that line again. Do you understand me?" His words were bullets, each one a calculated strike meant to wound, to remind her of her place. This was his territory, his son, his grief. She was an intruder. Elena lowered her head, a deep crimson flush creeping up her neck. She tried to speak, her voice a trembling whisper. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. He was crying. He was so upset, and I just wanted to calm him down." Her explanation was an apology, not a defense. There was no defiance in her, only the raw discomfort of someone who knew they had trespassed. She tried to explain further, her words tumbling out. "I saw him trying to pull himself up on the couch, so I thought maybe he wanted to try." But Alexander was a wall of ice. Her intentions meant nothing to him. "You thought wrong," he snarled. "You are not paid to think. You are paid to follow instructions. You will concern yourself with the chores you were hired for and nothing else." His tone was final, a gavel striking down her act of kindness as an act of insubordination. Visibly shaken, Elena nodded quickly, her gaze fixed on the floor. She seemed to shrink under the weight of his fury. The room became a vacuum, thick with tension. Leo, sensing the violent shift in energy, crawled closer to her leg, seeking refuge from the storm that was his father. Alexander turned away, a gesture of dismissal, but he couldn't escape the image seared into his brain. Leo, moving toward Elena with a focus, a trust, that he had never, ever shown to anyone. Not to the 7 nannies, not even to him. That sight disturbed him more than he would ever admit. Anger was easier. Anger was control. Admitting what he saw, that this woman, this maid, had succeeded in a single afternoon where he had failed for a year, was an admission of his own inadequacy. It was intolerable. So he clung to his rage, convinced that maintaining rigid control was the only way to keep the chaos of his life at bay. Still, his mind betrayed him, replaying the scene over and over. Leo's trembling legs, his outstretched arms, the flicker of determination in his eyes. Elena, meanwhile, busied herself with meaningless tasks, desperate to fill the suffocating silence. She gathered the scattered toys, folded a small blanket, her movements jerky and uncertain. She avoided his gaze at all costs. She felt the sting of humiliation, but beneath it, she couldn't erase the memory of Leo's effort. For her, it wasn't just a child's game. It was a breakthrough, a glimmer of potential that needed to be nurtured with patience, not stamped out by pride. She wanted to tell him that, to explain that it wasn't about overstepping, but about responding to a child's silent plea. But she knew it was useless. He wouldn't hear her. He couldn't. So she swallowed her words and accepted his cold fury, the fear that she would soon be the 8th casualty in his war against hope coiling in her stomach. Alexander finally slumped into his armchair, pretending to read financial reports, but the ink swam before his eyes. He could hear Leo's soft whimpers. The boy wasn't crying anymore, but he had crawled back to Elena's side, pressing against her as if she were his only shield. Alexander's chest tightened again. Why? Why did his son respond to her? He told himself it was a fluke, a meaningless anomaly, but the thought was a splinter under his skin. He remembered the way she had clapped for Leo's fall, the way his son's eyes had lit up, just for a second. No matter how hard he tried to justify his anger, to convince himself that Elena was out of line, a deeper, more honest part of him knew the truth. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against his forehead, as if to physically push the thought away. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against the world that had taken his wife, and another against the vulnerability she had left in her wake. The room remained heavy with silence, punctuated only by the soft sounds of Leo playing near Elena's feet. Alexander refused to look at them. Yet, in his peripheral vision, he saw it. His son, exhibiting a trust that had been absent for so long. A trust Alexander had never earned. He tried to harden himself again, to hold on to the conviction that she had gone too far and that his reaction was justified. But the image of Leo's 2 wobbly steps toward her kept replaying in his mind like a film loop. This wasn't just about an employee overstepping her bounds. This was about something deeper, something that threatened the very structure of the life he had so carefully, so brutally constructed after Amelia's death. And even as he sat there, cloaked in his cold, righteous anger, he knew. Elena had reached his son in a way no one else had. He could deny it to her face. He could fire her on the spot, but he couldn't erase what he had seen. Elena had already made her decision. After Alexander's brutal dressing down, she knew she couldn't stay. She informed him with quiet dignity that she would work out her 2-week notice period, leaving as soon as he found a replacement. Alexander didn't argue. He just gave a curt nod, his face an unreadable mask. Yet, finding a replacement took time. During those days, Elena moved through the penthouse like a shadow, performing her duties with meticulous care, avoiding him at all costs. But she couldn't avoid Leo. Every evening, after the oppressive silence of dinner, when Alexander would retreat to his office, Leo would grow restless. He'd fuss and cry in his crib, a small, lonely sound in the cavernous apartment. Elena couldn't ignore it. Even if she was leaving, her heart wouldn't let her. One night, acting on pure instinct, she lifted him from his crib, settled into the rocking chair in the corner of the nursery, and began to hum. It was a simple, wordless lullaby from her childhood in a village far away, a melody soaked in memory and love. The sound was soft, a repeating, gentle wave in the quiet room. To her astonishment, Leo's frantic breathing began to slow. His small, tense body relaxed against hers. It was the first time she had seen him soothed so quickly. From that night on, it became their secret ritual. After her chores were done, she would wait for his restless cries, then carry him to the chair and hum her simple tune. She sang no words, just a smooth, steady melody, as if the sound itself were a blanket. Leo began to anticipate it. His eyes would grow heavy, his tiny fists unclenching as he listened. Within minutes, he would be asleep on her chest. For Elena, it was a moment of grace, a quiet connection that made her forget the tension that permeated the house. She never expected anyone to notice. What she didn't know was that Alexander had started to pause outside the nursery door. The first time he heard the humming, he'd stopped out of irritation, wondering what she was doing in there. But as he stood silently in the darkened hallway, something unexpected happened. The gentle sound filled the sterile space with a warmth it hadn't known in over a year. He found himself staying longer than he'd intended, listening as her soft voice carried his son into a peaceful sleep he so rarely found. He told himself it was a coincidence. But the next night, he found himself drawn back to the same spot. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening. The melody was not polished or professional. It was something raw and real, and it unsettled him. From inside the room, he heard Leo's whimpers fade, replaced by the soft, even breaths of sleep. For a man accustomed to solving every problem with money and force, this simple, quiet act seemed like a form of magic he couldn't comprehend. He remembered sleepless nights, frantic calls to specialists, endless articles on sleep training for autistic children. None of it had worked. Yet here was Elena, a woman he had verbally eviscerated, calming his son with nothing more than a song. He never went inside. He never let her know he was there. But he couldn't deny the effect her nightly ritual was having. Not just on Leo, but on him. The crushing emptiness of the penthouse, the ghost of Amelia in every room, felt different when Elena sang. A part of him, a part he fought against, began to look forward to those few minutes each night. Elena remained oblivious to her silent audience. For her, this was simply what felt right. It was the lullaby her own mother had sung to her and her brother, a song of comfort and safety. She had no idea that it was becoming an anchor for two lost souls. Every evening, she entered the nursery with the same quiet resolve. She held Leo close, swaying in the old rocking chair, humming until his eyelids fluttered shut. She saw the small changes in him, the way he started to nestle his head against her shoulder without prompting, the way the tension bled out of his tiny limbs. These were signs of trust, proof that even in her short time here, she had made a difference. In those quiet moments, she almost forgot her decision to leave. The room felt sacred, a small pocket of peace in a world of turmoil. She believed it belonged only to her and Leo, never knowing that a third person shared it from the other side of the door. Alexander, meanwhile, was at war with himself. Each time he heard the lullaby, it stirred emotions he had tried to bury. It reminded him of Amelia, not because the voice was the same, but because it filled a similar space. The house had been a vacuum of sound, filled only with Leo's cries and his own harsh commands. The soft melody cut through that brutal silence. He found himself lingering longer each night, sometimes closing his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He would never admit it, but he needed those moments as much as Leo did. They offered him a reprieve from his own grief, a sense that his home was not just a tomb, but a place where comfort could, perhaps, exist again. Though he maintained his cold, distant facade during the day, at night he became an unspoken participant in their ritual. He began to dread her departure, wondering if the crushing silence would return, louder and more permanent than before. As the days of her notice period ticked by, the routine continued. Elena sang, Leo slept, and Alexander listened. Each night was the same, yet each night it carried a new weight for him. He told no one about his nightly vigil. He didn't want Elena to know, and he refused to face the vulnerability that came with admitting his dependence on her. Still, he couldn't stop coming back. The melody was no longer just for the nursery. It was filling the empty spaces in his own broken life. He still intended to let her leave, convinced it was for the best. But deep down, he feared losing the only sound that had started to make his house feel like a home again. What do you think is going through Alexander's mind as he stands outside that door every night? Is it just about Leo, or is something else beginning to happen inside of him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're invested in this story, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Alexander wasn't looking for anything in particular when he opened the small cabinet in the hallway closet. He was searching for some old household warranty documents Mrs. Gable had filed away. As he shifted a stack of crisp, folded linens, something slipped out from between the layers of fabric. It was a simple, slightly worn photo frame. Curious, he picked it up. The picture showed a much younger Elena, her arm wrapped tightly around a teenage boy who shared her dark eyes and gentle smile. But the boy's gaze was distant, his posture slightly awkward, his hands held in a fist near his chest. Alexander looked closer, a jolt running through him. He recognized the subtle signs, the familiar patterns of movement and expression he saw in his own son every single day. The boy in the photograph was autistic. Elena, however, was beaming, her embrace both protective and proud, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. The image hit Alexander with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly, it all made sense. Her impossible patience, her calm, steady voice, her intuitive understanding of Leo's needs. This wasn't a lucky guess or a textbook technique. She had lived this for years. Standing there in the dim light of the closet, the photo in his hand, Alexander felt his carefully constructed anger and resentment crumble into dust. For the first time, he understood that Elena's actions weren't interference, they were instinct, born from love and experience. She didn't just understand a child like Leo. She understood Leo. He carefully placed the photo back where he found it, but the image was burned into his mind. For the rest of the afternoon, he was completely distracted. During a tense conference call about a multi-million-dollar merger, his mind kept drifting back to the sound of Elena's humming. Later, as he passed the nursery, he saw her on the floor, patiently helping Leo stack blocks, her quiet presence a stark contrast to the chaos in his own head. He saw her differently now. Not as an employee who had crossed a line, but as a sister who had shouldered a responsibility most people couldn't imagine. He thought about the years she must have dedicated to her brother, the deep well of patience it must have required, the frustrations she must have felt but never showed. It explained everything. The way she celebrated the smallest progress, the way she never tired of repetition, the way she remained a beacon of calm when Leo was overwhelmed. Alexander realized with a sickening lurch that all the professionals he'd hired, with their impressive resumes and clinical approaches, had lacked the one thing that truly mattered: an understanding that came from the heart. Maria had that. The thought was both humbling and profoundly unsettling. For a year, he had told himself that no one could care for Leo the way Amelia would have. He saw now how wrong he'd been. Elena could never replace his wife, but she possessed something that no other person who had walked through these doors had: a shared language with his son. Later that evening, Richard stood at his office window, the city lights a blur below, his mind racing. He had maintained a cold, professional distance from Elena, their interactions brief and transactional. But after his discovery, that distance felt artificial and wrong. He remembered something Amelia had once said, that with a child like Leo, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a superpower. He realized Elena had been showing him that superpower for weeks, and he had been too arrogant and blind to see it. A decision began to form in his mind, one that felt foreign but absolutely necessary. When he finally left his office, he found Elena in the kitchen, wiping down the counters after dinner. She looked up, startled by his presence, her body tensing as if expecting a reprimand. Instead, Alexander paused, his usual stern mask replaced by a flicker of hesitation. For the first time, he spoke her name softly, without an edge of anger or command. Elena. She froze, shocked by the change in his tone. She nodded politely, waiting, her guard still up. Alexander cleared his throat, feeling a strange discomfort in his own skin. "Would you join me for tea?" he asked, his voice steady but uncharacteristically gentle. Elena blinked, certain she had misheard. He had never, not once, invited her to sit with him. She glanced at the counter she was cleaning, then back at him, and gave a small, hesitant nod. He motioned towards the living room, and they walked in an awkward silence. When Mrs. Gable brought the tea service, Alexander poured it himself, another small act so out of character that it made the air feel electric. The atmosphere was surreal, as if she'd stepped into an alternate reality. She sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, unsure of the protocol for this bizarre new dynamic. Richard broke the silence. He told her he'd noticed the way Leo responded to her, that her presence seemed to unlock something in his son that no one else could. He admitted, the words tasting like rust in his mouth, that she had accomplished more in a few weeks than all the experts he'd hired combined. Elena listened, her hands wrapped tightly around her warm teacup, her heart pounding. For Alexander, the confession was excruciating. He had built a fortress of authority and control since Amelia's death, convinced that his way was the only way. To sit here and admit that someone else, his maid, had succeeded where he had failed, felt like both a surrender and a liberation. He looked at Elena, his gaze direct. "I know your patience comes from somewhere real," he said softly. "I know you have experience, caring for someone like Leo." He didn't mention the photograph, but his meaning was clear. He was letting her know that he saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Elena lowered her eyes, a knot forming in her throat. She realized he must have found the picture of her and her brother Matteo. A part of her felt exposed, but another, larger part felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For so long, that part of her life was a secret she carried, afraid it would be seen as a liability. To hear him speak of it with something akin to reverence was disarming. The conversation ended quietly. Richard didn't pry or ask personal questions. He simply leaned back, his tone softer than she could ever have imagined, and said her name again. "Elena," he said, "thank you." Those two words, spoken with such raw sincerity, carried more weight than any command he had ever uttered. Elena simply nodded, unable to speak, but a warmth spread through her chest. That night, as she lay in bed, she replayed the conversation in her mind. Richard, meanwhile, remained in the living room long after she'd left, staring at his untouched tea, knowing that the very foundation of their relationship had irrevocably shifted. He had finally let down his guard, and in doing so, he had acknowledged the profound gift she had brought into their broken home. The storm hit late in the evening, a sudden, violent assault of wind and rain that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Thunder cracked like a whip, and the city below vanished behind a sheet of water. Richard was in his office, staring blankly at a spreadsheet, his mind adrift. Oliver was in his room, already agitated by the noise, and Maria moved quietly through the apartment, a calming presence in the growing chaos. Then, with a final deafening clap of thunder, the power went out. The penthouse, usually a blaze of artificial light, was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Richard froze, his heart seizing as the sound of Oliver's terrified scream ripped through the silence. The boy's wail escalated into a full-blown panic, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. Richard scrambled toward the nursery, using the flashes of lightning to navigate. When he reached the door, he stood paralyzed, helpless. Oliver was thrashing in his crib, his small body trembling, his hands yanking at the rails. He was completely overwhelmed by the sensory assault of darkness and noise. Richard's paternal instinct screamed at him to do something, to comfort his son, but his body wouldn't obey. His feet were rooted to the floor. Every possible action felt futile, every imagined word of comfort hollow. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, the familiar crushing weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him. In his mind, each of Oliver's cries was an indictment, proof that he wasn't enough, that he would never be enough. Maria appeared at his side, a ghost in the darkness. She moved with a calm, steady purpose that seemed impossible in the chaos. She held a lighter, and with a flick of her thumb, she lit a candle on the dresser, its warm, flickering glow pushing back against the oppressive shadows. She quickly lit several more, her movements efficient and confident, a stark contrast to Richard's frozen state. Once the room was bathed in a soft, wavering light, she went to the crib and lifted Oliver into her arms without a moment's hesitation. She held him close, rocking him gently as her voice began its familiar, soothing melody. The lullaby she sang on quiet nights now became a shield, a lifeline in the storm. Oliver's screams slowly fractured into sobs, then into ragged whimpers, his small body gradually surrendering its tension as he burrowed into her. Richard watched from the doorway, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He hated how easy she made it look, how effortlessly she had done what he was incapable of. But beneath the anger and self-loathing, an immense wave of relief washed over him. Oliver was calming down. It had seemed impossible just moments before. The guilt inside him intensified, but alongside it grew a grudging admiration, a recognition of a strength he did not possess. He stumbled closer, his voice barely a whisper when he finally spoke, his words nearly swallowed by a peal of thunder. I don't know what to do." Maria didn't turn. She continued swaying, her song a constant, unbroken thread. Richard sank onto the small armchair near the crib, his gaze fixed on his son's face in the candlelight. "I keep failing him," he choked out, the words tearing at his throat. "Every time he needs me, I just freeze. I don't know how to reach him. I don't know how to be what he needs." He paused, his hand covering his face, his chest heaving. For so long, he had hidden his fear behind a mask of anger and control. But here, in the storm-tossed darkness, with the candlelight painting dancing shadows on the walls, he felt stripped bare. His voice cracked as he finally gave voice to the terror that haunted his every waking moment. "I'm so afraid I'll never be enough for him." It was the first time he had ever spoken the fear aloud, and the weight of the admission left him trembling. Maria finally turned her head slightly, her lullaby softening to a low hum. Her eyes, calm and deep in the flickering light, held no judgment. She shifted, moving to sit on the arm of the chair beside him, balancing Oliver between them. The baby's breathing was even now, his face peaceful against her shoulder. Maria reached out her free hand, slowly, giving him time to pull away. He didn't. He let her take his hand, her touch surprisingly firm, grounding. Richard closed his eyes, a strange mix of shame and relief flooding him. He had never allowed anyone to see him this exposed, this broken. Yet Maria didn't offer platitudes or tell him he was wrong. She simply held his hand, a silent, steady anchor in his personal storm. In that moment, Richard felt a knot he'd been carrying for a year begin to loosen. For the first time, he allowed himself to be weak without shame. The storm raged on outside, but inside the nursery, the atmosphere had transformed. Oliver was quiet, his body relaxed. The candlelight cast long, gentle shadows that danced on the walls. Richard's hand remained in Maria's, though no more words passed between them. The silence was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of grief. It was a silence of shared understanding, a silence that gave him space to breathe. He felt that she wasn't trying to carry his burden for him, but simply sharing its weight, reminding him that he was not alone in the dark. He had spent a year pushing everyone away, convinced no one could understand his pain. Yet here was Maria, sitting beside him, her quiet strength showing him that his fear didn't have to consume him. He felt small, but not useless. Weak, but not abandoned. For the first time, he started to believe that maybe being enough wasn't about having all the answers or never failing. Maybe it was just about showing up and not giving up. As the storm outside began to recede, a quiet stillness settled over the room. Oliver had fallen into a deep sleep. Maria gently placed him back in his crib, tucking a blanket around him, before returning to her spot on the arm of the chair. Richard was still there, his hand still linked with hers. He didn't thank her. He didn't try to explain himself. There was no need. Maria didn't speak either, sensing that words would only shatter the fragile honesty of the moment. In that shared silence, Richard felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time: the profound relief of not having to pretend. The blackout had exposed more than just the absence of light. It had forced him to confront the truth he had buried beneath layers of pride and anger. And though he had admitted his weakness, he did not feel diminished. With Maria's steady hand in his, he felt something new taking root inside him, something he thought he had lost forever. The courage to keep going, even in the dark. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the city outside seemed to hold its breath. Maria sat on the nursery floor with Oliver, a few soft toys scattered around them. She had learned his rhythms, his boundaries. She never pushed. She invited. That day she picked up a plush, floppy-eared rabbit and gently tapped it against her own head with an exaggerated "oof." She made a funny face and let out a playful, "Oh no." Oliver blinked, his deep brown eyes tracking the toy. Maria repeated the motion, this time brushing the rabbit against his arm before snatching it back with a little boop sound. Oliver's lips parted, his eyes widened with a spark of curiosity. And then it happened. A small, strange sound bubbled up from his chest. A short, breathy, uneven giggle. Maria froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Realizing what it was, she leaned closer, repeating the playful movement. This time the laugh came louder, fuller, a genuine, unrestrained peal of laughter. Oliver's small chest shook with the force of it, his very first real laugh, and the sound filled the room like a burst of sunlight. At the doorway, Alexander stood motionless. He'd come home early, intending only to check on Oliver before retreating to his office, but the sound had stopped him dead. He had never heard his son laugh, not once. For a year, the soundtrack of his son's life had been cries, whimpers, or a vast, terrifying silence. The sound of laughter was a possibility he had long ago packed away with Amelia's belongings, a dream he'd convinced himself would never come true. Yet here it was, raw and real, echoing in the nursery. His throat constricted as he watched Oliver's little face light up, his mouth open in pure, unadulterated delight. He had grieved so many missed milestones, words unsaid, steps not taken. But this was different. This wasn't a developmental benchmark. This was joy. This was proof that his son felt safe, that he was capable of happiness. Alexander leaned against the doorframe for support, his chest aching with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotions. For the first time in a year, his heart swelled not with grief or frustration, but with a gratitude so intense it felt like pain. Maria, still on the floor, seized the moment. She made the stuffed rabbit hop toward him, pausing dramatically before tickling his belly with its soft ears. Oliver shrieked with delight, the laughter spilling out of him again, his little body squirming. His cheeks were flushed, but his eyes shone with a light Alexander hadn't seen since the day he was born. Maria clapped softly, laughing with him, her own joy mirroring his. She had no idea Alexander was watching. For her, this was just a precious, private victory. She had seen Oliver's struggles, his retreats into himself. For him to laugh so freely, without fear or reservation, was a miracle. The room, usually so heavy with unspoken sorrow, was now alive with the sound of his son's giggles. It was the kind of sound that made the rest of the world fall away. Alexander's eyes blurred, and he blinked hard against the moisture. He had spent a year trying to create a perfectly controlled, disciplined environment for Oliver, believing that rigid structure was the only way to protect him. All it had done was turn their home into a sterile cage. Watching from the doorway, he finally saw the truth with blinding clarity. What Oliver needed wasn't rules and order. He needed comfort. He needed safety. He needed someone who made him feel secure enough to let go. Maria had given him that, not with a curriculum, but with kindness. She had built it through thousands of small, patient moments that he, in his grief-stricken arrogance, had completely overlooked. He swallowed hard, the realization of his own failure a bitter pill. This laugh wasn't just Oliver's victory. It was Maria's. She had found a key to a door he didn't even know existed. And for the first time, instead of resenting her for it, he felt a profound sense of awe. He stepped into the room, his movements slow, almost reverent, terrified of breaking the spell. Maria finally looked up and saw him. She straightened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, wondering how long he'd been there. For a heart-stopping second, she braced for another rebuke, another reminder of her place. But his face was different. The cold mask was gone. His features were soft, almost fragile, his gaze locked on Oliver, who was now hugging the stuffed rabbit, still letting out soft chuckles. Richard walked closer and lowered himself into the armchair nearby. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, and let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you, Maria," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. The sincerity in his tone was absolute. This wasn't the distant gratitude of an employer. It was the raw, humbled thanks of a father who had just been given back a piece of his world. Maria simply nodded, her own eyes glistening, understanding everything he couldn't say. For Alexander, that moment was a turning point. He realized that laughter had done what millions of dollars and an army of specialists could not. It had shattered the silence that had haunted his home since his wife's death. Oliver's laugh was proof that joy could exist here again. He looked at Maria and finally understood that what had been missing from their lives wasn't discipline or order. It was the one thing she had brought back into their home: a sense of hope. The man who had once been consumed by a need for control now bowed his head slightly, humbled, grateful, and irrevocably changed. Oliver's laughter continued to echo softly in the background, a sound Alexander knew he would never forget. It wasn't just his son's first laugh. It was the sound of their home beginning to heal. Maria sat in her small, neat room, the letter clutched in her hands. It was an official offer of admission, with a full scholarship, to a prestigious program specializing in developmental psychology for children with autism. It was the school she had dreamed of attending for years, a dream she thought had died with her brother, Matteo. For so long, she had wanted to dedicate her life to helping children like him. And now the opportunity was real, tangible, printed on heavy cardstock. A wave of joy, immediately followed by a crushing wave of guilt, washed over her as she read the words for the 10th time. The thought of leaving Oliver was a physical ache in her chest. But this wasn't just a job. It was her calling, a chance to fulfill a promise she had made to her brother long ago. Unsure what to do, she folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, a secret she wasn't ready to share. She tried to act as if nothing had changed, but her mind was a battlefield. Every moment with Oliver now felt precious and borrowed. The secret was a heavy weight, and her quiet preoccupation did not go unnoticed. Alexander saw the shift. He noticed the subtle way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He saw her pause mid-task, her gaze lost somewhere far away. He heard the quiet sighs when she thought she was alone. She was still patient and attentive with Oliver, but a shadow had fallen over her. Alexander, however, reverted to his old habit of avoidance. He told himself it wasn't his place to pry. He convinced himself she was just tired. But a deep, cold unease grew in him. He had come to depend on her presence, on her steadying calm, more than he would ever admit. The thought of losing her was a terrifying possibility he refused to entertain. So he said nothing, carrying the weight of his own unspoken fear in silence, while every day it became harder to ignore. Then, one evening, Oliver got sick. It began as a low-grade fever and quickly escalated, leaving him weak, flushed, and whimpering in discomfort. Alexander's carefully controlled world shattered. He panicked, his mind a chaotic mess of worst-case scenarios. But Maria stepped in with an immediate, calm authority. She bathed Oliver's forehead with cool cloths, administered medicine with a steady hand, and held him through the long, difficult night, her soft humming a constant comfort against his fevered cries. Alexander hovered uselessly in the background. Every time he tried to help, his hands shook. His fear of doing the wrong thing paralyzed him. He felt like a stranger in his own son's life, watching as Maria masterfully navigated the crisis. He could see the exhaustion etching itself onto her face, the dark circles forming under her eyes. But she never faltered. She was a rock in the storm, and watching her made him feel both profoundly grateful and utterly worthless. As the night wore on, Alexander's composure finally broke. While Maria stayed by Oliver's side, he slipped out into the hallway and collapsed against the wall, burying his face in his hands. He felt utterly powerless, suffocated by his son's suffering and his own glaring incompetence. His chest ached, his eyes burned, and finally the tears he had held back for so long came. He wept silently, his shoulders shaking with grief and fear. Fear of losing Oliver, fear of his own failure, and a deeper, more terrifying fear he hadn't let himself acknowledge until now. The fear of losing Maria. He realized in that gut-wrenching moment how much he depended on her, not just for Oliver but for himself. The thought of her leaving was no longer a vague worry. It was an unbearable prospect. He stayed there in the darkened hallway, ashamed of his weakness but unable to stop the flood of emotion. Maria eventually stepped out of the nursery to get a fresh cloth and found him there, a crumpled, broken man against the wall. She froze, seeing the raw grief on his face. She saw his trembling hands and the glint of tears in his eyes. Slowly, quietly, she crouched beside him. She didn't speak. She knew words would only make him retreat into himself. Instead, she rested a hand gently on his shoulder, a simple, grounding touch. Richard looked up, startled, his face streaked with tears. But Maria's expression held only a quiet, steady compassion. For a moment, he wanted to blurt it all out, to beg her not to leave him, not to leave them. But the words wouldn't come. He was caught between his pride and his desperation. Maria stayed with him, her hand a firm, comforting weight on his shoulder. She could sense the battle raging inside him, but she knew she couldn't force it. It had to be his choice. Until then, she would simply be present, offering her silent strength. Inside, her own heart was torn, the acceptance letter a burning secret in her mind. She wanted him to ask, to give her a reason to stay that was stronger than her reason to leave. Richard, sitting beside her, felt her unwavering presence, and realized she was waiting for him. For the first time, he thought that asking for help, admitting he needed her, might not be a weakness, but the only strength he had left. Yet, he still couldn't say the words. Not yet. Richard hadn't set foot in that room for over a year. Not since the funeral. Amelia's bedroom had become a sealed tomb, a perfect, painful time capsule of their life before. Her perfume still lingered in the air. Her books were still stacked on the nightstand. One evening, driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The air was thick with memories, and the ache in his chest became a physical pain. He moved slowly through the room, his eyes tracing the familiar objects. He was about to leave when he noticed a drawer on her writing desk was slightly ajar. With a trembling hand, he pulled it open. Beneath a stack of stationery, there was a single sealed envelope. His name was written on the front in Amelia's elegant, looping script. His breath caught in his throat. He sank onto the edge of their bed, his heart hammering, and carefully tore it open. It was a letter, written in the final weeks, when she knew her time was running out. He began to read, her voice echoing in his mind with every word. She wrote about Oliver, about her all-consuming fear of leaving him, about her hopes for his future. "My dearest Alexander," it began, "I know you. I know you will try to bear this burden alone. You will try to be his rock, his shield, his everything. Please, my love, do not confuse strength with isolation. Our son will need more than just you. Let people in. Let him find love and support in the most unexpected places. Do not measure his progress by society's milestones, but by the moments of connection he finds. His joy will not be loud, but it will be profound. Look for it, nurture it, and please, please do not let your grief build walls so high that no one can ever climb them. Richard's vision blurred. He read the words again and again. It was as if she had seen the future, seen the man he had become, and had written this letter as a lifeline. For a year, he had done exactly what she had begged him not to do. He had rejected help, demanded perfection, and pushed away anyone who tried to get close, all in a misguided attempt to honor her memory. Now, her own words shattered the prison he had built for himself. He pressed the letter to his chest, his body racked with sobs. He didn't fight them this time. He let himself grieve, not just for her, but for the year he had lost, for the pain he had caused, for the father he had failed to be. He lay down on the cold floor, clutching the letter, whispering apologies into the silent room. Exhaustion finally claimed him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep, her letter his only comfort. Morning light streamed through the window. Maria, starting her daily routine, noticed Richard's office was empty. A flicker of concern led her down the hall, where she saw the door to Amelia's bedroom was open. Peeking inside, she saw him asleep on the floor, the letter still clutched in his hand. The sight was startling, not because of where he was, but because of the raw vulnerability in his posture. The powerful, controlled man she knew was gone, replaced by someone fragile and broken. She started to back away quietly, but a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Richard stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked, disoriented, his gaze finally focusing on her in the doorway. He saw the concern on her face, saw her about to retreat to give him his privacy. But before she could move, he reached out, his hand catching her wrist. His grip wasn't forceful, but it was desperate. It stopped her. Maria froze, looking down at him. The silence in the room was electric, filled with everything they had never said. Richard's eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, met hers. The walls were gone. There was no pretense, no armor. He was just a man drowning in his grief, his fear, and a desperate, flickering hope. He swallowed, his voice a raw whisper that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. Stay. The word was simple, but it contained a universe of meaning. It wasn't an order from an employer. It was a plea from a man on his knees. In that moment, he wasn't the billionaire, the boss, or the stern father. He was just a man admitting he couldn't do it alone. Maria stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat. She had waited for him to say it, and now that he had, it was more powerful than she could have ever imagined. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her hand still in his. She understood that everything had just changed. The letter, the grief, the storm. It had all led them to this. Richard held the letter to his chest with one hand, but his other hand refused to release her. For the first time since Amelia's death, he was allowing himself to lean on someone. And in that moment, Maria knew she could never walk away. Richard had rehearsed the words 100 times in his mind. The fear of Maria leaving had become a constant low-grade hum beneath the surface of his days. Amelia's letter had been the final push he needed, stripping away the last of his pride. He could no longer deny the truth. Maria was no longer just an employee. She was the glue holding their fragile world together. That evening, he found her in the living room with Oliver. The boy was stacking wooden blocks, his small hands surprisingly steady. Richard's heart did a familiar flip, that painful, beautiful mix of pride and fear. He walked closer, his voice quiet but clear. "Maria." She looked up, her expression calm, questioning. He sat down in the armchair across from her, The same one he'd sat in the first day he'd seen her with his son. He clasped his hands, a nervous gesture she'd never seen from him. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice softer than she was used to. Oliver, oblivious, giggled as his tower of blocks came crashing down. Maria offered him a quick, reassuring smile before turning her full attention back to Richard. He cleared his throat. "I don't want you to leave," he said, the words coming out in a rush. The sentence hung in the air between them, heavy and real. Maria's eyes widened. He leaned forward, speaking faster now, as if afraid his courage would desert him. "Not as an employee. Not just until I find a replacement. I want you to stay as part of this life, with us." His voice cracked on the last word, but he pushed on, the dam of his restraint finally breaking. "You've done more for Oliver than I ever could have dreamed, but this isn't about a salary or a contract. I want you to belong here, not because of a job, but because we need you, because—" He looked down at his hands, the final confession almost a whisper. "Because I need you." The raw honesty of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She sat frozen, trying to process it. This was a man she had once seen as a cold, unreachable tyrant. Tears welled in her eyes, and she fought to hold them back. "I know you have your own dreams," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "The school, your studies. If you stay, I will help you with all of it. Whatever you need, time, resources, my full support, you will have it. I don't want you to sacrifice your future for us. I want you to build it here, with us, as part of this family." He looked up, his pride gone, replaced by a desperate vulnerability. "I can't do this alone, Maria, and I don't want to anymore." He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a home, a place. Tears finally spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth as a sob escaped. Oliver, sensing her distress, tugged on her sleeve, making her let out a watery laugh. She looked back at Richard, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "From the first day Oliver took a step toward me, from the first time I sang him to sleep, I was already part of this family. That was never about a job. It was about love." She took a shaky breath, the tears still coming. "I don't need to be asked to stay because in my heart, I never truly planned on leaving." Her words, so simple and true, washed over him, and he visibly deflated, the tension draining from his shoulders. Oliver clapped his hands, delighted by the emotional display. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Maria, and for the first time in a year, a genuine smile spread across his face. It was warm and unguarded, the smile of a man coming back to life. Maria returned it, wiping at her tears, the heaviness of the moment lifting, replaced by a radiant, soaring hope. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one where Oliver's laughter, Maria's strength, and Richard's acceptance would finally create a home. He stood up, walked over, and crouched beside Oliver, looking from his son to Maria. "We're not just three people in a penthouse anymore, are we?" he whispered. Maria shook her head, her eyes shining. "No," she said softly. "We're not." For the first time, Richard truly believed it. They were no longer just surviving. They were becoming a family. And in that realization, he felt lighter than he had in years, knowing he hadn't just asked her to stay. He had finally acknowledged that she had belonged with them all along. The day of Elena's graduation was bright and clear. The university auditorium was buzzing with the energy of celebration. Elena stood among her fellow graduates, her heart a fluttering mix of pride, disbelief, and profound gratitude. She remembered the endless nights of studying after Leo was asleep, the early mornings, the constant juggle. There were so many times she had wanted to quit. Yet here she was. In the audience, Leo, now a bright-eyed young boy, sat proudly next to Alexander. He clutched a large, handmade sign. In colorful, slightly crooked letters, it read, "My Mama, My Hero." As Elena's name was called, as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Leo shot to his feet and held the sign as high as his small arms could manage. Elena saw it, and for a moment, the world stopped. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the diploma to her chest, her smile radiant. Alexander stood and applauded, his clapping loud and steady, his face a canvas of undisguised emotion. He watched the woman on the stage, the woman who had transformed from a quiet maid into the confident, brilliant mother of his son, and his heart felt full to bursting. He remembered Amelia's letter, her plea to let Oliver find love in unexpected places. Seeing Elena up there, he knew he had honored his wife's last wish in the most beautiful way possible. Elena hadn't just cared for their son, she had saved them all. After the ceremony, Leo ran into her arms, shouting, "Mama, you did it!" Elena knelt and hugged him tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We did it, my love," she whispered into his hair. Alexander approached, his own eyes glistening, and wrapped them both in his arms. The three of them stood there for a long moment, a complete, unbreakable circle. That evening, back at the penthouse, a new photograph had been placed on the mantelpiece. It wasn't of Alexander and Amelia. It was a photo taken that day. Alexander, Elena, and Leo, huddled together, smiling, their faces alight with joy. The house was no longer a silent monument to the past. It was alive with laughter and warmth. Later, as things quieted down, Leo curled up on the couch. "Mama," he said softly, "can you sing the song?" Elena smiled. She began to hum the familiar, simple lullaby, the one that had been their first connection. Her voice was steady and warm, filled now with years of shared memories. Leo rested his head on her shoulder, his eyes growing heavy. After a moment, a second voice joined hers, deep and a little unsteady at first, but growing in confidence. Alexander was humming along. Elena looked at him, her smile widening. Leo opened his eyes and whispered, "Louder, Dad." Alexander chuckled and began to sing the wordless melody, his voice blending with hers. The song that had once been a lifeline in the darkness was now a celebration, a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they had built. It was no longer a lullaby for a lonely child, but an anthem for a family, forged not by blood but by choice, patience, and a love that had bloomed in the most unexpected of places. Alexander wrapped his arm around Elena, his hand finding hers, and looked at the new photograph on the mantel. They were a family, whole, healed, and finally home. And that is where we'll leave this incredible story. I am so grateful you stuck with me to the very end. What did you think? What was the most powerful moment for you? Let me know in the comments below. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the family we choose is the one that truly saves us. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will hit you right in the feels. Until next time.